The 1980s were a time when cars were becoming more and more bold, expressive, and emotional. Against that backdrop, Volvo looked almost like the complete opposite. Its cars were associated with rational thinking, safety, and practicality. No showmanship, no attempt to impress, just calm and sensible family cars. Even though Volvo did offer fast, turbocharged versions, the brand developed a strong and persistent image as a car for older people. The problem was that this image did not fully reflect reality. People did not choose Volvo because of their age, but because of their mindset. These were buyers who valued logic and reliability rather than emotion. But in the broader public perception, that distinction no longer mattered. Simple and clear labels tend to dominate, and they are what shape a brand's reputation. At some point, Volvo understood this and decided to take a different direction. In 1986, the 480 was introduced, a car that looked nothing like a typical Volvo. Front-wheel drive, pop-up headlights, and a very unconventional design. This was an attempt to bring more emotion into the brand and attract a new audience. The only question is whether Volvo managed to change its image, or if this experiment turned out to be a mistake. I think this story should start with the image that became attached to Volvo in the 1980s, and why it was partly unfair and partly created by Volvo itself. It all began in 1959, when Volvo became the first company to introduce the three-point seatbelt, developed by engineer Nils Bohlin. The belts we use today are, in essence, based on the same design as those early Volvo systems. More important than the invention itself was what it represented. This is the moment when safety became part of the brand's core identity. Volvo understood earlier than most that trying to cover every segment would only lead to average results. To lead, you have to choose a direction and fully commit to it. Volvo chose safety and practicality. In the 1960s, the Volvo Amazon and the 140 series continued that approach. Along with seatbelts, they introduced reinforced passenger cells and crumple zones. Safety was no longer an option, but the result of a consistent and structured engineering philosophy. The 240 series, introduced in the 1970s, only strengthened that image. It became known as one of the safest, most reliable, and most practical cars on the market. At the same time, safety itself was becoming a trend, and other manufacturers started moving in that direction, trying to catch up with Volvo. Volvo was mostly chosen by upper-middle-class buyers who were not chasing excitement but valued what the brand offered. Professors, doctors, engineers, academics. In the United States, the 240 found a similar audience, and Volvo developed a reputation as a sensible European car. But there was another side to this. Around the same time, Volvo began to pick up the label of a car for older people. The design was conservative and restrained, and younger buyers simply looked elsewhere, choosing something more expressive. And while this image was not entirely fair, since families and retirees are not the same group, those distinctions did not matter in the broader perception. Media, younger audiences, and the public did not focus on such details. By the 1980s, Volvo had already entered the decade with a firmly established reputation as a car for older drivers.
Of course, Volvo was not satisfied with that image and tried to move away from it.
By the 1980s, a new group had formed, the Yuppies, young, ambitious, and financially successful people who, both in Europe and in the United States, preferred to spend their money not on retirement cars like Cadillac and Volvo, but on something more sporty and emotional, while still being well-built and reliable. Cadillac tried to appeal to this audience with the Seville, designed in a neo-retro style, but that only reinforced its aging image. Volvo approached the problem more pragmatically. The company introduced turbocharged versions of its existing models, which did deliver stronger performance. For example, the Volvo 740 in turbo form produced close to 180 horsepower and could reach 60 miles per hour in about 8 seconds. At the same time, Volvo did not emphasize this in its marketing. The focus remained on safety and practicality. Visually, the turbo versions were almost identical to the standard cars, so they were bought by the same customers, just with a preference for more power. As a result, the brand's image did not change, and Volvo decided to take a more radical step. At first glance, the most logical move would have been to enter the segment occupied by the Mercedes 190 and the BMW 3 Series. cars that were more youthful, prestigious, and carried a hint of sportiness. But the Volvo 300 series, despite its similar size, did not compete with them either in positioning or in purpose. And even with its strengths, it was not seen as a car for younger buyers. In other words, there was a clear gap for Volvo to fill. However, the company chose to go even further, into one of the most youth-oriented segments at the time: compact pseudo-sport hatchbacks, where cars like the Volkswagen Scirocco, Honda CRX, and Toyota Celica were leading. In that segment, individuality and design mattered most, and these cars were often bought as second vehicles in a household. The new Volvo had to be fundamentally different from the brand's existing lineup, and one of the key requirements was that it would become Volvo's first front-wheel drive car. Although the first sketches were created partly by Volvo's Dutch division, the final design of the car was shaped with input from several design centers and under the supervision of the headquarters in Gothenburg. This was a unique opportunity, and if our project had been rejected, it could have meant the end of Volvo's Dutch division, recalled Robert Koch, head of design at Volvo Netherlands, who was responsible for the development of the 480. In 1981, the Dutch proposal was finally approved in Sweden, although it faced strong criticism from Jan Wilsgaard, who believed the future 480 did not reflect the spirit of Volvo. As Koch later explained, the team faced a difficult task. The car had to look sporty, but at the same time maintain a recognizable connection to other Volvo models, which almost sounded like conflicting requirements. In the end, the designers managed to find a solution, although with a nuance. The 480 remained recognizable, but not in relation to contemporary Volvo models. Instead, it echoed the much earlier Volvo 1800 ES. Both cars shared a shooting brake layout, with a long hood and a rearward cabin, while the rear glass of the 480, which also served as the trunk lid, directly referenced the earlier model. One of the defining elements of the design was the pop-up headlights, which were a highly fashionable feature among sporty cars at the time. Yet even entering this segment, the new model was not meant to stop being a Volvo. Like the larger models, the 480 followed the brand's internal logic. Safety remained a priority. The car featured a reinforced passenger cell, crumple zones, and a body structure designed to manage impact energy. Front-wheel drive was also presented in marketing as a safety feature, offering more stable behavior on wet and snowy roads. It also included ABS, reinforced doors, and head restraints, features that were still optional on many cars of that era. Compared to competitors, who focused mainly on design and emotion, this was a noticeable difference. At the same time, Volvo did not rely on safety and practicality alone to attract younger buyers. The 480 introduced a number of features that are common today, but were unusual for compact cars in the mid-1980s, including illuminated door locks, a follow-me home function, and an onboard computer. The first examples of the 480 were shown to the press in the fall of 1985, but the car did not go on sale until 1987. Overall, the new Volvo was received positively by both journalists and buyers, although with some reservations. Many pointed out the interesting and, by Volvo standards, unusually youthful design, especially the pop-up headlights and the glass rear section. The level of standard equipment was also praised. At the same time, there was criticism, and it mainly focused on the engines. The 480 used power units developed together with Renault. For Volvo, this was a necessary decision, since the company did not have its own compact engines. More importantly, these engines did not match the level of reliability that people expected from Volvo. The base options were 1.7-liter engines, in both naturally aspirated and turbocharged form. These units, especially the turbo version, had relatively complex electronics, and the turbo engine itself required more complicated maintenance and was sensitive to overheating. Later, a 2-liter naturally aspirated engine was added to the lineup as a simpler and more reliable alternative to the 1.7 turbo. Even though the turbo version offered power comparable to a Golf GTI, both the press and customers criticized the 480 for lacking a truly sporty character. The design suggested one thing, but the driving experience delivered something else. The reason was that Volvo tuned the suspension and overall behavior of the car for comfort and stability rather than sharp handling. The 480 was also heavier than its competitors, and in many ways behaved like a typical Volvo of that era. The most important factor, however, was the price. Volvo placed the 480 in a difficult position. In the United Kingdom, the base version started at around £10,000, while the turbo version was closer to £12,000. This made it more expensive than most of its direct competitors, including the Peugeot 205 GTI and the Ford Escort XR3i, and roughly on the same level as the Golf GTI and the BMW 3 Series. Sales started off weak, which was expected. The main markets were the United Kingdom and the Netherlands, where the car was also built. Volvo decided not to bring the 480 to North America. Even with an existing dealer network there, the cost of certification and adapting the car to local regulations was too high, while the chances of recovering those costs were very low. At the same time, Volvo did not lose enthusiasm. In that same year, 1987, the company announced plans to develop a convertible based on the 480. For many, this came as a surprise and even seemed like an overly bold move. The goal was to retain as much of the coupe's technical foundation as possible in order to keep production costs under control, while still meeting Volvo's usual safety standards. The convertible was expected to remain safe even in the case of a rollover. That is why, unlike most convertibles of the time, which relied mainly on the windshield frame, the 480 Cabrio was designed with an additional protective structure behind the rear seats. In the end, the car itself looked promising and could have competed with convertibles from BMW and Volkswagen, but it never reached production. The supplier responsible for key body components went bankrupt, and Volvo still had concerns about rollover safety. Only 2 480 Cabrio prototypes have survived to this day, one of which is kept at the Volvo Museum in Gothenburg. The model remained in production until 1995, after which it was discontinued without a successor, which in many ways was expected. Over its entire production run, only about 76,000 Volvo 480 cars were built, and comparing that figure to the volumes of its competitors, or even the Golf, does not really make sense. The difference is obvious. Inside Volvo, however, the project is still considered a success, with an important qualification. It was successful for the company itself, but not in commercial terms. The 480 gave Volvo its first real experience with a front-wheel drive platform, expanded its engineering base, and provided valuable practical knowledge. From a sales perspective, the result was weak, and Volvo chose not to develop this direction further. Instead of trying to break its established image, the company focused on its strengths and continued to develop what it already did best: safety and practicality. The Volvo 480 is a bit like a grandmother, sincerely trying to pick out an outfit for you for a party, based on her own idea of what is fashionable. The result is charming, a little naive, and over time it leaves you with a warm smile. Something similar happened with the 480. Today its design is seen as interesting and even stylish, but at the time the market simply was not ready for it.